and we are live on YouTube.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we haven't started the show yet.
Oh, okay.
We're just going to have fun for a moment. This is going to be a I guess, political show. Mm-hmm. So, we've been doing a lot of those lately.
All right, but they're not necessarily political, huh?
Not necessarily. I'll talk about movies.
Okay.
I've shown slides of my home vacations, home movies, vacations.
Oh, I see.
Anything. I can do anything you want. When you have a podcast, I think you were telling me that you had done some podcasting.
Yeah, I have like a smaller podcast myself that I do for a different sub on Reddit. It's one where I'm a moderator. It's our intellectual dark web. So it's
dark web.
Yeah. Well, ooh. Yeah. Well, this is a different type of dark web. I don't know if you've heard of the intellectual dark web.
No.
It concerns.
I've heard of the dark web.
Yeah. So the intellectual dark web is kind of a tongue-in-cheek name for this loose affiliation of public intellectuals. Some of them you may have heard of, people like Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, Brett Weinstein. They're both brothers. Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro. Those are some of the more common names that are usually associated with that. It's basically a loose term to describe people who like to have long-form, good faith conversations about political and cultural and social issues.
Wait, that's what I do.
Yeah. Which is part of why I was attracted to this this thing we're doing here, because
only reason because there's no audience. It's not going to do you any good at all.
Exactly. There's a general consensus among people involved with the intellectual dark web, or the IDW as it's abbreviated, that the last sort of 2 decades or so of news media on television, where you can only get in maybe 10 to 15 minutes and things are reduced to sound bites, has been good for the communication.
15 minutes is long these days. Right.
And it's not been good for communication or the articulate spread of ideas, and it's been in some ways a catalyst to the polarization we've seen between the political parties. Okay. And so when you can get into the thick of it, it's hard to be sort of painted into a cartoon, as people often do when they appear on CNN, regardless of what their beliefs actually are.
Yeah. So that's a Reddit sub.
Yes.
But you also do a podcast on it?
Yeah, it's something I do is within the community mainly. I've mostly just done it with other people who post there, and I let them all sort of bring a topic that they want to discuss. Cool. Some of them are political, some of them aren't, but they're mostly of some sort of intellectual bent.
So you have a studio?
I don't have a studio myself. I have a Yeti microphone and a laptop, and whatever quiet space I can get at the moment.
Yeah, that is what we in the podcasting business call a studio.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I'll be sure to refer to it as a studio from now on.
Yeah. This palatial studio in the bonus room above the garage, this is kind of aspirational for podcasters.
Yes.
I get a lot of folks who say, can I come see it? Which I invite people over. Mm-hmm. And then they go, do I have to do this? No, you don't have to do this. All right, let's do a show. Get to my music, and away we go. From the studio in the bonus room above the garage on the north side of Cary, at the foot of Mount Belzoni, this is the Triangle Talk Show. It is episode 62. Actually, I'm not going to call this politics. I'm going to call it 2020, because I think I made the promise of doing, when I was going to do stuff that had to do with the upcoming election next year, I would flag them as 2020. I don't really remember if that's what I promised or not, but it's what I'm promising now. It is June 12th, 2019, and this episode is Joe Parrish for NC House and other stuff. I am this guy. I am Gary Pierce, and Joe Parrish is this guy.
Hey.
And I think got a title. Candidate for North Carolina House in the 56th North Carolina House District.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you here. I was made aware of your existence by a post you put on Reddit.
Yes.
Apparently you're quite a Redditor.
Yeah, I've been more active on Reddit in the last year or so, especially since I quit Facebook.
You're one of those folks that quit Facebook.
I really got sick of the platform. It's been nothing but, I think, a net negative both for me individually, but I also think for society in general. So I got off end of last year.
Did you actually delete the account?
Yes, I did a full deletion of everything.
So somebody else can steal your name now.
Probably, but
whatever.
There's a lot of Joe Parrishes as it is. I've made my peace with that.
Okay. I'm still there. When you got a show, and I've in a couple of groups and stuff that pretty much live on Facebook, and to leave Facebook, I'd be leaving them, and I don't want to do that. But yeah, it's a sewer. It can be. On the other hand, so can Reddit.
Yeah, Reddit can be, but I feel like it's a bit slower paced than Facebook. Reddit is in many ways, especially if it's more community oriented rather than, I think, individual oriented.
Yeah.
And people aren't looking at your personal feed; they're looking at the feeds of different topics and areas and communities.
Yeah, it's different.
Yes.
The thing that I noticed, and the reason that I invited you to the show, was that you put up a post saying that you work in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Not as a job, it's as a politician, I guess.
Yes, as a politician, activist, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and you had started a caucus within the North Carolina Democratic Party for transgender people.
Yes, that's something the North Carolina Democratic Party created this weekend. State Executive Committee, for those who don't know, which is the governing body of the state party, passed a unanimous vote creating it by approving its bylaws. And so I was one of the I votes in that room that day, and I thought it'd be interesting for people to know, so I made the post on Reddit to let people know about it.
Okay, so it wasn't your original idea.
Right, I wouldn't say I'm a founder of it. As one of probably about over 400 I votes, I was a creator in that capacity.
Okay.
I have some knowledge on, I guess, the motivations behind its creation. It's an interesting statement on the state of the Democratic Party, but I wasn't one of the ones who spearheaded its creation.
Okay. Yeah. You're not, and you pointed out you're not transgender yourself.
Right.
But sympathetic, which these days, just about everybody in the Democratic Party will be.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I have thoughts that maybe some of the I votes that in the room that day to create it weren't necessarily out of a place of sympathy, but out of a place of maybe opportunism.
Expedience.
Yes. Well, I mean, so some of this goes back to, I wish I could remember their name, but one of the people who was actually behind, like, you could say is a founder of this caucus, the Transgender Caucus, maybe 1 or 2 meetings of the SEC ago, so it would have been within the last year, basically, they announced their desire to have a separate caucus. Previously, there's been an LGBT Democrats, which is there are several affiliated organizations with the Democratic Party. Common ones being like the LGBT Democrats for the Democratic Women or the Young Democrats. So normally, I guess if transgender members of the party wanted an affiliated organization that was more suited to them, LGBT Democrats would be the way to go. But and
because
again,
the T is transgender,
right? And I wish I could remember their name, but when they spoke at this meeting, they basically said that something to the effect that transgender members are not taken as seriously by the LGB part of the LGBT Democrats.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, they may not be gay.
Right.
Or lesbian.
That might be the thing. And I guess it shouldn't be taken for granted that was the message they were getting out, that LGB and T people necessarily get along. And so they wanted their own caucus so that they could just pursue their own goals and agenda without having to butt heads with people who don't seem to care, or maybe against the way they feel. And I mean, I guess that's not too surprising. Like, for example, Caitlyn Jenner was, you could probably see the main catalyst to why transgenderism is a big thing on people's radars today, coming out. And yet Jenner doesn't support gay marriage, for example. Jenner's a Republican. I mean, right? So there are things like that where LGBT isn't necessarily a happy family around the campfire. And in some ways, the Transgender Caucus, while there were people who were hoping to do a benign service to transgender Democrats, I think in some ways you could perhaps reasonably suppose that some of the I votes in the room that day were from people on the LGBT side of things that were just happy to get rid of what they thought was an obstacle to the agenda they had within the LGBT Democrats.
Do they actually want to drop the T from LGBT? And there's actually a Q in there too, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if they would come out and actively say that. I think it's just something that there's this unspoken friction that's going on, which contributed to these transgender Democrats wanting to have their own caucus.
It's interesting. I'm not going to quite call it odd because people are people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I, thinking about it a little bit, which I probably have never done until this minute, the issues, the needs, the existence out there in public is different. Mm-hmm. What would draw them together would be that they are all tossed under a similar bus by people who are opposed anything but plain old ordinary heterosexual sex in the missionary position.
Right. Yes.
You go beyond that and you've lost them. And so anybody with an LGBTQ label in front of them, they're bad. Mm-hmm. They're awful people.
Right. They're
that. Going to hell.
Yeah. And
taking the rest of us down with them.
Yeah. I think we might be starting to see how that commonality might just not be enough for some people.
Yeah. That does put them together, but then their own individual issues would separate them some because they need some focus on their specific issues. What would divide them, that's kind of beyond me, other than just humanity, because people are like that.
Yeah. Well, there are some possible things that divide, and some of it's just because people really, there's a lot of disagreement even among transgender people about what applies with concepts around gender and do not. Some transgender people are of the mind that if you're, say, a trans woman and you date a cis woman, that you're then homosexual. There are some who don't think that, and this is, again, when you're aligning yourself with LGB. That's an unfortunate ambiguity to have.
Yeah, and I'm chuckling not because it's funny, but because it's interestingly funny.
It is interestingly. I mean, it's one of those such is life moments.
Yeah.
So I can sort of see that. Yeah. So it's not surprising to me that didn't mean to bump the mic. It's not surprising to me that that some of this happened because. It's hard to see how you can resolve some of those disagreements in a way that everybody's happy. And I think, again, going back to the fact that simply not being a typical straight person just might not be enough for some people. Because, I've always been a big believer of it's always easier to be for something than not something. To make positive statements as opposed to neutral or negative statements.
I think it's better, but it's not easier.
Right. Well, yeah, I guess you could say that too. Like, I myself am an asexual person. I'm not inclined to associate asexuality with LGBTQ stuff. Yeah. Simply because
let's take one step back and define a few things, because I had to go look up a few things.
Okay.
As I'm getting, I'm old. I'm 69 years old. And there's terminology here in our progressive field, the sexuality and progressiveness that I didn't understand. For example, I probably discovered for the first time sometime this year what cisgender means.
Okay.
And it turns out I are one.
Okay, yeah. So I'll talk about asexuality first.
Okay.
So asexuality, to put it in simplistic language, are just people who don't feel sexual attraction toward other people. So a good way to imagine it is you think of how straight people are to the same sex, right? And how gay people are to the opposite sex. You basically take those two qualities and put them together, and you have people just don't feel attraction toward anyone.
Yeah.
That's what asexual people are. And there's a variety of ways that it manifests. You have asexuals who are okay with sex, they'll enter romantic relationships, have children with their partners, and to that extent they have a sex life, but they don't actively seek it out. They can go without it. You have asexuals who are absolutely repulsed by sex. They think it's disgusting, and they mostly remain celibate their entire lives. If they do have a sex life with a romantic partner, they often regret it, and then they don't do it anymore. So there's some variety within asexuality, but these are people who aren't seeking sexual relationships. They're people who ultimately aren't going to end up sexually frustrated because it's not something that interests them, that sort of thing.
I can think of some big advantages.
Right.
Are you willing to say where you fall?
I don't have any really kind of experience dating or anything. I don't really know what my own comfort zone is, so I don't think I could really say it. I could just say I'm not particularly motivated to pursue romantic and sexual endeavors with other people.
I mean, sex drive, in addition to launching a million movies and taking down countless political careers, is just a problem.
Yeah, it is.
And you're looking at that through a window saying, ain't my problem.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can totally say that. If I've learned one thing about asexuality, it's that people don't care a whole lot about it.
People don't know anything about it.
Right, and so it can be good in some ways, it can be bad in other ways. There'll be people who... I've run into situations where people know I'm asexual but still say I'm a straight person or whatever because... I guess they have a different idea of what makes a straight person.
They need to put you in a familiar box.
I guess that is what it is. And when you look at, say, like the current Me Too movement, right? In many ways, I like a lot of where it's going, but I do realize that there's certain new rules and certain things you can't say or do, and a lot of it is based on perception. And so when people look at me, they're probably not likely to see an asexual first. They're more likely to default to assumptions that I'm heterosexual. I have to modify my behavior accordingly so that I'm not doing anything that might, offend or intrude on a person's comfort zones or personal space or anything based on those assumptions, because that's the world in which we live. And it's still important to be respectful. So, being asexual, in many ways, I have a life that's more by the rules of a straight person, just because that is the default, and you don't really stand out by being asexual. And that's true of, I guess, all sexualities, but oftentimes you can, if you're homosexual, it can stand out a bit just because there's a culture around it. There's not really a culture around asexuality that does make it stand out from the rest of the population.
Yeah, and there are gay people that you wouldn't know. Are because they don't have any of the stereotypical mannerisms about them.
Right.
There are gay people that do, and there are straight people that you would swear are gay because they have mannerisms that, once again, stereotypical. But they're not. They're not gay.
So there are exceptions, and but yeah, asexuality is one thing that's in some ways it's good, some ways it's bad. Is without stereotypes. You're
not really likely. I'm gonna. Let me make an assumption and you tell me whether I'm right.
Okay.
You're not going to fall into the Me Too trap. Because you're not going to treat someone based on, well, I suppose you could. I mean, I suppose if you were accultured to treat women a certain way, it doesn't matter whether you're thinking of them as a sexual object or just an inferior being, you could act that way. I get the impression you wouldn't, though.
No. I guess depending on what you mean by the Me Too trap, I guess I'm not going to fall into it. I'm definitely not going to do anything that would, I have no motivation to do anything that someone who just has, the more typical carnal impulses as it pertains to sex would have. But I have noticed one thing about Me Too is that accusations can be thrown out and people will immediately believe them. And sometimes we do find that these aren't true. There was an interesting case where one of our public defenders in Orange County, I can't recall her name, but she spoke to a meeting of the Northern Orange County Democrats a few months ago. I asked her if she thought the Me Too movement had an impact on criminal cases involving sexual assault. And she said it does, and that juries are more willing to convict people even when the evidence is firmly in favor of the defendant. Simply because... she asked the jury after a case once, why they made the decision they did, and they told her, well, when a woman says something, we believe it. So I do think that
is a phrase of the
right,
Me Too movement,
and that's why
I'm
always very mindful of the fact that the fact that I know I'm asexual isn't important because I understand that perceptions are different and that I need to work with people as with what they're comfortable with from me, as opposed to what I might logically determine is should be comfortable for other people. Right.
Yeah.
So there's it. Me Too is one of those things where there's some good and some bad with it. I try to promote the good and while being cautious with the more negative sides of it. Yeah.
I guess I want to toss out that I don't have a problem with flipping the perception of who might be guilty and who might be innocent, and who to believe, at least on the outset, because we spent so many years, so many decades with a woman not being believed to begin with, that if we reverse that and say, well, we're going to start with a presumption that she is telling truth, we're probably going to end up with more justice. Sure, we're going to run into women who are vindictive, who take advantage of it. Once again, people are people. But I got a feeling we're still going to end up with more justice. Not perfect justice, just more justice.
Yeah, I suppose we'll see, where we end up with that new paradigm. Time will tell.
Drives men crazy.
I think it is important that at the very least, when there are accusations, we take it seriously, because it's just something we didn't do in the past. And there are a lot of extremely tragic stories out there that, I've heard or seen. I've heard personally or seen on the news just because people weren't believed.
Yeah.
And, I think it's crazy that sometimes it comes from people's own family members, the disbelief. And that's definitely a social paradigm that needs to change. And insofar as Me Too can get us toward that, that's good. I guess I always try to err on the side of agnosticism with a lot of issues. So I'm always very slow to go too far or make a firm decision prematurely. Yeah. And that's just my natural temperament.
That's one of those where you kind of got to make a decision. And unless we default to everybody's wearing body cameras all the time, there's still not going to be proof.
Right.
You can have proof that there was sexual contact because of DNA evidence, but you can't have proof of motivation.
Right.
Unless somebody else was there. And
exactly.
Most of the time, nobody else is there. Cisgender. I discovered I am one. That's just someone who identifies as the gender of the sex they were born into.
Yes.
I got that right?
That's the general definition as I've heard it. It is one of those things, even within what you might call, we'll say left-wing gender orthodoxy, for lack of a better term, where there's some disagreement, but that's more or less the nucleus of what it's trying to get, what you said right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
New terms have come on the scene. They've been bisexual for a long time. There is now pansexual. And I've looked up articles trying to understand what the difference is, and the articles I've seen have basically said, it's just a different word.
I think one thing that pansexual might clarify more is that I think bisexuals are typically more inclined toward people who aren't transgender. And then, in addition, pansexuals might even include intersex people. And that actually might be a key difference right there, because, being intersex is a very different existence. It's much more physiological, pertinent to, how you live your life.
And I think that's a term that is brand new to me tonight.
Right. I think there's a general term that is perhaps too narrow that most people used to know, hermaphrodite, based on the Greco-Roman deity Hermaphroditus, who was literally half male and female physically. Intersex includes people, so people who have both sets of human genitalia, includes that which we used to designate as hermaphrodites. It also includes people who are, say, genotypically, say, male, but end up phenotypically female. So they're still sterile. They still don't have, and they still have a type of physical existence that's in between male and female, but they possess, they'll say, it's some sort of anomaly that occurred while in utero, where their male genetics did not manage to manifest into a male physiology or anatomy, and so they appear female. And until you actually investigate, you'd probably think they're female their entire life, because that's how they develop. But they would have incomplete female organs, but no trace of male organs, as I understand it.
Okay, so it's going to be really rare.
Right. Yeah. So we're talking about probably 1% of the population or less.
But for one of those people, it is 100% of their life.
Right, exactly.
And something that the rest of us, many of the rest of us, have a real hard time wrapping our heads around.
Yes. This is a similar thing with transgender folk. I think transgender folk are considered to be 0.3% of the population. And this is often where we get into things where people talk about gender being binary or not, or whether humans are binary or not. There's a recent good term I heard recently, which is that humans are bimodal, but not binary, which means that for the most part, we're in terms of sex, we're male or female, and that is just this what our species is. It's how our species reproduces. It's the humans that we see, 100 years from now are going to be there because of this bimodal system where males and females are able to reproduce. Same with other species in the animal kingdom, but there are exceptions that occur just due to weird anomalies in physical development. Sometimes based on genetic mutations, sometimes based on things that happen in utero, based on hormonal fluctuations and all sorts of things.
Yeah. And I'll add the snark to it. It's because of intelligent design. I don't mind a little snark now and then. I grew up, of course, thinking that sex and gender were the same thing. Mm-hmm. Not anymore.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I myself have never really been able to understand what gender is really supposed to mean. It's always been, some people seem very certain about it, but I've seen explanations for what gender is vary a bit. For me, I guess the question would be, some people will tell me that I'm cisgender, because my identity is consistent with my anatomy and my genetics, right? I'm genotypically male, I'm phenotypically male, and my identity is consistent with that. Now, what's always interesting to me is I don't really know how I do identify as a male. A term is often used to describe a transgender person's experiences. Let's see, say the female body, they say they feel male on the inside. I myself don't know what it likes to feel. I don't know how I would say I feel male on the inside, because as far as I'm aware, everything about me that I think of as me being male is strictly physical. Like I know what it's like when my male body parts behave a certain way, but I don't know if I were to say that I have a thought pattern that I would describe as male. I don't know how I would do that. It's particularly difficult for me because I grew up with the fairly egalitarian feminist idea that you don't want to label certain behaviors as male or female. You just want to label them as just generally human behaviors, so that you don't make assumptions about men or women, right? So if you say that men are confident and commanding, are you implying that women aren't that way, that they're passive and servile? Those are implications I don't want to make. So it is difficult for me to sort of put it all together, because the kind of feminism, and I know, and there's even different kinds of feminism. The kind of feminism that I've always stuck to is really difficult to square up with that if we're just going by strict classical logic, if A then B type of thinking. So yeah, it is a tricky thing, and again, it might speak to why there might be some friction within LGBT communities, and that led to something like a transgender caucus forming separately from the LGBT Democrats, because that is an unfortunate conundrum to have within your community. What it means to be male or female, physically or mentally or spiritually, depending on how people do it. And that's one thing I've noticed, where there's a lot of diversity even among transgender people. Some transgender people see it as a spiritual thing. Others aren't spiritual people. They're very deterministic, atheist type thinkers, and that's an explanation that doesn't work for them. And developing a consistent standard that, again, will make everyone happy is not easy to reach. And I think that's why we see some of that. Yeah. So some people would describe me as cisgender. And I don't even know if that would necessarily be true, as cisgender is usually defined, because I think it does help if you have an idea of gender to tie the word to in your own self-identification. I identify as a lot of things. Like, I identify as a progressive, right? I don't know if I could say I identify as a man. Some people might say I'm still cisgender. I mean, some people would say, okay, you're not cisgender. Who knows?
Yeah. I couldn't say.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask some very personal questions.
Okay.
You can decline to answer if you want. Do you get erections?
Yes, I do. Yeah, those are mostly involuntary. That's a standard part of male development. Most people are familiar with the concept of morning wood. This is a feature that we developed evolutionarily, and most men will get erections throughout the day as well. But the morning wood occurs. The reason why we have sexual arousal that occurs at night is because men who frequently get erections have their penile muscles intact for when they do get to reproduce. We have to think of human experience. The way our bodies are designed was for the way our conditions were 10,000 years ago, not today. 10,000 years ago, you didn't have as many opportunities to reproduce because it was hunter-gatherer society. You had to focus you couldn't waste time and energy on things that would threaten your immediate survival. And you didn't necessarily always have mates available at the ideal time that were willing to mate with you because you had a smaller tribal society. You couldn't go to some sort of speed dating thing, for example, and meet 100 people, right? It was very narrow.
No
so you
Tinder.
had the human male body's way of making sure that the penile muscles aren't atrophied when they finally do get that opportunity is through the regular occurrence of erections.
Okay, that is going to be my excuse from now on from all of my behavior up until this date.
Well, some erections occur because people are gross, but
some of it's just pure sexual attraction.
Right.
A lot of it, I think.
Yeah, but it inevitably occurs. I don't know of any other asexual men who specifically never get erections.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And if I say it's because of sexual attraction, I can understand that that's a concept that is foreign to you.
Right. Yeah. It's foreign to me insofar as it's not something I feel, but it's not foreign to me insofar as I'm aware of it. It's the norm in our culture. I see it in our media. So
it's all around you. It is beat into you.
So yeah, I don't know if I'd say beat into me. It doesn't feel like it's been a difficult thing seeing it. Right. I know there are some asexuals who are annoyed by the fact that most people experience sexual attraction, but I just sort of see it as part of our culture, just as dropping a G with present participles is part of our culture, and we'll say thinking instead of thinking sometimes, right? I look at it as something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Moving on. Unless there's something about this that you want to add.
I would say don't make any assumptions about asexuals with me. As far as what they're going to like or not like, what they're interested in or not interested in. They're about as diverse and unique as straight and gay people. There are things that they will think are sexually inappropriate or not. And, you'll hear some of the filthiest humor from asexual people sometimes. Just because they might not be into that thing doesn't mean they don't know a punchline when they see
can
one.
get it.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we go on to your burgeoning political career, let's just talk about the Democratic Party and the stuff that you've been involved in. Where are you from? From here?
So I'm from North Carolina, yes. I'm originally from a town called Timberlake. So that's over in Person County, not too far away. I currently live in Chapel Hill, but Person County, Timberlake, that's where I grew up and spent most of my life. I went to Carolina, got my degree in political science there, graduated in 2014. Spent a couple more years in Timberlake, and that's where I did my first House race. I decided ultimately afterwards that I needed to move to a constituency that more accurately reflected my values and priorities. And so Chapel Hill seemed like a good place to go just based on my own experiences there when I lived there as a student, and just also based on voter data, if you just look at it, right? And, political science degree, the voter data is one thing I pay attention to where I'm able to find it.
Yeah, you ran your first race in North Carolina House District 2, which is up in the Person County area, basically north of the Triangle area, up toward Virginia. That's in U.S. House District 1, isn't it?
It did change recently with the redistricting. So I believe currently it's not in Butterfield's district. It's in Walker's district. So that's the 6th, I believe.
Okay. So District 1 is one of our 3 Democratic congressional districts.
Yes.
So
yeah, it borders it, though. Granville makes up the westernmost reaches of District 1, which is just east of Person. And Person is now the easternmost part of District 6. It used to be the dead center.
Yeah, things are changing, and still will be. I just saw something today that the League of Women Voters has a lawsuit going that's requiring more North Carolina legislature redistricting that they won, and it was either the House or the Senate just voted on a map, and it's going to go to the other body. So, new map's coming.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see.
You may be districted out of 56.
You never know. I don't know what the future holds. I have a feeling, though, that these districts aren't likely to change much, just because we've had, 2 map changes since the 2016 election. The current borders for districts 56 and 50, so those are the 2 that have territory in Orange County, didn't really change much as a result of that. Most of the districts that needed to be fixed were, I think, in the Wake and the Mecklenburg area, because that's where the gerrymandering was found to be illegal. For
the video, folks, I'm showing the map that shows where 56 is.
Yep,
which is a small district because it's right around
small.
Chapel Hill.
Yeah, it's population dense. It's basically, as I can tell, the municipal territories of Chapel Hill and Carrboro, but instead of conforming to the municipal borders, I think it's the precinct borders. But that's basically what it is, Chapel Hill and Carrboro. So, pretty blue area. But I wouldn't argue it's a very unfairly drawn map because it's a fairly distinct geographic, cultural area. Okay. And making a district around it isn't the craziest thing. It's not, and it's not even that badly drawn. It's fairly compact too. But I think districts 56 and 50 are fairly non-controversial, not where the legal focus is. I'd be surprised if they change much unless there's some sort of the Republicans really decide to start from square one and try something completely different. I don't know how that will go, and you can never really tell what they'll do next. But I suspect any districts that do change will probably be in the counties that are very populous and large and have lots of districts. So that we're probably talking about Wake, probably talking about Mecklenburg, probably talking about, my guess would be probably the ones that radiate out from Mecklenburg a bit, and probably the ones around Greensboro, that area, and probably some of the ones near the northeastern part of the state a bit.
Okay. What I was getting at when I was talking about the race you had in District 2 and how that corresponded to U.S. House District 1 was a Democratic district, but you were pretty well shellacked.
Yeah.
In that race. That was in 2016. You skipped 2018, right?
Right. I didn't run for anything in 2018.
Okay. So 2016, you were running, of course, the whole U.S. House District 1 is real big. It includes Durham, and then it goes up to the state line and then almost out to the coast. And it is a majority-minority district, but I don't know how well that fit in with House District 2 at the time.
Right.
In any case, you were beat by a Republican.
Yes.
Approximately 60% to 40%.
Yeah, 60-40 was roughly what it was.
That's something of a drubbing.
Yeah.
Why did that happen?
I think it's a reflection in part of the change of the times. So another useful data point is to look at the Moss campaign, which ran in 2018. So he basically
racing going on
he basically
outside.
ran as the Democrat like I did in 2018. Daryl Moss was the former mayor of Creedmoor who ran. The state party recruited him to be the candidate that year. They couldn't recruit anyone in 2016 to run. So that's part of why I was the nominee in the first place, is that nobody of note wanted it, and I thought I would at least get my feet wet in electoral politics, and figured, it's not impossible that I'll win. So I enjoyed an uncontested primary in that sense. And but I'm a person who's not particularly well known. When we look at the last Democrat who held the seat in that area representing Person County, that was Winky Wilkins. He'd been well known in the local media among Person. It was also a different Democratic Party at the time, less polarized time than we see now. There are a lot of folks who live in Person County and other rural parts of the state who have really been burnt out in the Democratic Party, and where they might have made an exception and voted for the odd Democrat here and there on a mostly Republican ballot, they won't do that anymore. They won't consider someone who's a Democrat, except in cases where the only candidates are Democrats. So this is common in like sheriff races or register of deeds races, where people are doing the old traditional thing of running as Democrats for those offices. But outside of that, you're not going to see a lot of these rural conservative voters who previously would have voted for people like Winky Wilkins voting for Democrats anymore. But anyway, to get to the data point with Moss, he basically got about 45% of the vote. And the districts were redrawn, but House District 2 did not change radically. Its borders were mostly the same. It was perhaps a little bit fairer. There were these weird tentacles that went into sides of Oxford to isolate African American neighborhoods from House District 2. Some of that was improved a bit, but overall you didn't see a massive shift in the constituency of House District 2. So Darrell Moss, with about 20 years as a mayor in Creedmoor, within that district, with the kind of name recognition that comes with that, and with the tremendous support he got from Break the Majority, ended up only getting an extra 5%. For me, what you could look at my candidacy, what might be useful for my candidacy just for future projections is, mine is a bare minimum thing. It's someone who doesn't have name recognition. It's someone who doesn't come from money or have money or know people with money to fundraise from, who didn't get help from the state party, who basically it was just the basic minimum of having a candidate on the ballot to oppose a Republican. And we can say that within a district like House District 2, 40% is what will vote for our party no matter what.
This is from 2016. This is the final vote. Larry Yarborough was the Republican, also an incumbent.
Yes.
And 60.64%, 22,760 votes. You managed, so the 14,775 votes you got was sort of the default people who are going to vote Democrat.
I would say that
what.
A Democrat who got less than that would have to go out of their way to embarrass themselves at that point. And that probably wouldn't be Democrats switching to the Republicans. It would just be Democrats who'd be too afraid to bubble in their name at that point, just out of sheer whatever that person did that puts them off that much. I guess similar to how Trump did better in some states just because people didn't vote for Hillary in the traditionally blue states. But yeah, 40% is what you're working with if you're a Democrat as a starting point there. With a lot of work, we saw that we got an extra 5%, which, that leaves another 5% to bridge the gap and get to a winning election. When we look at someone like Senator Mike Woodard, he's previously, he lost Person County, and I can't speak for Granville so much, but he lost Person County for the first time in 2018. But when he ran in 2016, 2014, 2012, he always won it with a majority. Slight majority that gradually declined, but he did. Now, he also had the incumbency advantage. I think another thing to Mike Woodard's credit is...
He was a Democrat?
Yeah, he's a Democrat. So
okay.
his is pretty much a safe seat because he has northern Durham County. So he's getting all those blue votes from there. And so, the person, despite leaning conservative, has enough Democrats and is sufficiently sparsely populated that it doesn't impact the votes that come from Durham. But to Mike's credit is he doesn't take Person for granted. When I was there, I saw that he was always intending things, always interested in the local issues with Person, wasn't simply sitting atop his throne given to him by his Durham voters. He treated all of his constituents equally, and I think a lot of people understand that. But we're saying that even with that, his margins have been declining, and I think that's representative of the partisan attitudes that are developing in this state, where people are committing to a side, and you see it with Democrats as well, where they might have been willing to vote for a Republican or two on their ballot, are no longer willing to do that. So House District 2, based on some of the older but not terribly old, we're talking last decade, voting trends, would arguably be one of the most balanced and flippable districts in the state. But we're seeing that being less and less the case. One thing that might help districts like House District 2, because it's still not the reddest. I mean, there are Republican districts that are 60-40 just as a starting point in favor of red. Some are 80-20, kind of like District 56 is 80-20 for Democrats, roughly speaking. I think one thing we've lacked is maybe we don't really have a dynamic Democratic candidate at the head of the ticket during the presidential election years, like we did with Obama. Obama, if we look at, again, what happened with Person County is we got a huge turnout in the African-American voters in Person County. And they're about 20% of the population there. And that got us the majority of the Board of Commissioners, which is, those are 5 at-large seats. But they're staggered 3-2 every 2 years. But that got us the majority. It actually got us the first time we had 2 African Americans on the county board. So they actually had double their representation of what their the demographic statistical number is, which was very impressive feat. And that was a result of the fact that people were excited for Obama.
Yeah, coattails.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's becoming more significant now as the parties become more polarized, because the presidential name really sets the tone. And then in the interim years, if you don't have something like that motivates people, that can be a problem. And I think right now we have maybe some wind in our sails from reaction against Trump, but that's whatever gains we get from that. Like, we got some gains in 2018 from that, no doubt, but that's ephemeral. The Democratic Party as a brand, as its own brand, is pretty weak right now. And we need something that's going to continue to deliver victories to the party after Trump is gone. Whether he loses in 2020 or whether he just hits his term limit, we need the 20s really need to be a good decade for our party.
I'm chuckling because it almost sounds like you're talking from the vantage point of a Republican needing somebody after Trump is gone. The Democrats also need somebody after Trump is gone.
Well, yeah, we need to be more than the party of anti-Trump. And that's one of the most unfortunate things that has happened in the wake of the 2016 election, is that's really what we
can think of a lot of unfortunate things. I'll count that as one of them, maybe not the most.
Yeah, I mean, I myself was a big fan of Bernie Sanders in 2016. I think one of the things, just from if you look at it from an outside strategic point of view, is that with Bernie Sanders came this notion of the Democratic Party having an identity, of standing for something apart from who is on the Republican side. I mean, we've seen all these, retroactive accounts of people who worked on Hillary's campaign. Not even they could say amongst themselves what they thought Hillary stood for. Because she ran there were just vague ideas. It was a very soundbitey campaign, but not one that had a lot of substance. She is a person who had changed her stances on things so many times without obvious reasons that it made people uncertain about where she truly stood. Then those documents got out about her believing in having private and public positions on things that made it even more unclear about where she stood. To the average voter, that's problematic. And I think that's one reason why we're seeing a decline in people registering as Democrats as we get newer generations registering to vote, and more of them are remaining unaffiliated. Because while they might agree for the most part on a lot of the stances the Democratic Party takes, they don't think that there is the proper character, I think, behind those stances, and they can be very wishy-washy. And with the right donor, a Democrat can stand for anything, even terrible things. I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of problems. We don't have, and we didn't put up a candidate that disavowed those notions in 2016. And the more that we just try to be about being the party of anti-Trump and avoiding taking initiative on issues and setting priorities that aren't concerned with Trump, the more we're going to feed into that image of the party.
Okay. I want to go back to District 2 for a minute.
Let's do that.
Because that's where you started.
Yes.
And before you ran, how did you get involved?
That's an interesting
what
story.
dragged you into politics to begin with?
I would say it was the war in Iraq. So I got involved in politics very early. I saw Michael Moore's documentary Fahrenheit 9/11 when I was 14. And up to that point, I had wanted to be, I guess I would have become an astrophysicist if I had never had that side of me awakened by that documentary. I loved researching the stars and the cosmos. That's sort of what I had in mind when I was in the 8th grade. But when I saw that documentary, I realized that, Well, I mean, for one, just seeing everything that went into causing the Iraq War to happen, all the lies, and then all the needless deaths and suffering and violence that occurred from it, that just made me angry. And there was this moment where it just clicked with me that this is really important, and there's always going to be people who will just... People are going to learn stuff about space anyway, because there's always going to be curious people, but it's just not a guarantee that people are going to do the right thing in government. And I guess I've had this instinct that the one person I can always trust to do the right thing is myself. I can't trust George W. Bush to do it. And so that following year when I started in high school, I got involved in the Person County Teen Democrats there. I became the secretary, and then after that, I became the president of the organization. And so I got involved in canvassing. I was a Senate page for Senator Kinnaird, who, interestingly, at the time represented a Senate district that comprised both Orange and Person counties. So people who currently have Senator Foushee still remember Senator Kinnaird as their senator, who she succeeded when Senator Kinnaird retired. So I was her page for her in 2007. That was actually my first job of any kind for which I was paid as a 15-year-old high schooler. And so my first thing I ever did was something in public service. I'm always happy about that, even though it was only 4 days. And I was involved in Young Democrats a little more sporadically during my college years, the UNC Young Democrats specifically.
I'm guessing that's a much bigger thing in Orange County than it was up in Person County.
Yeah, it was, because it's more populous, and it's the University of North Carolina. I would have been more involved. I still did some canvassing and went to meetings. My time was a little more carved up with my involvement in the Army ROTC program they had there, as well as my time in the National Guard. So there was weekends I spent in uniform training that I couldn't spend knocking doors per se, or doing similar events for the party. I began to toward the end of my college years, though, one thing that was really pivotal for me was the Edward Snowden leaks. I lost any interest of continuing to serve in the military, and gave up basically finishing my ROTC program and getting a commission as a lieutenant, which the Army was actually happy to do at the time, because this is just before ISIS really blew up on the map. And so the Army, some people might remember, was downsizing at the time. So any cadet who was willing to just give up any claim to being an officer, they were happy to accommodate them. So it was actually pretty easy for me to get out. And then that triggered some clauses with my guardsman contract that led to me getting just a simple discharge from the Guard. So it was actually a much easier return to civilian life than I thought. But it really felt like a stab in the back. After something like Fahrenheit 9/11 gets you involved in politics in the first place, and you see all the lies that went behind it, with things like the Patriot Act, to see that similar things were being done under the Obama administration, and that he was then trying to prosecute the guy who exposed it, it felt like too big of a betrayal.
We probably shouldn't assume everybody listening or watching is intimately familiar with what Snowden really revealed.
Right. So he revealed how the federal government had been spying on people basically through their phones, through the internet, without warrants, looking at things like that. He was a
contractor for the NSA.
Right. And he had tried to, he had concerns about this, because in his view, this violates the constitutional protection where you need a warrant for search and seizures. The issue for him is that these were unwarranted searches that were occurring of people's, private property and information. And so he tried to go through internal channels to address it, and he kept getting rebuffed for I think a period of about 2 years. Eventually he said, this is too big for the American people not to know about it. And so he, leaked the information about it. He whistleblew it. Gave up his whole personal life to do it. That was one of the things that really impressed me about what he did.
And continues to, because he's living in Moscow.
Right. He has to live in asylum. That's a pretty big sacrifice. There are not very many people in the post 9/11 world who've been willing to make that big of a sacrifice for their country.
So what he revealed wasn't directly involved in the Iraq War.
Right.
But it sounds like it took your enthusiasm for being part of what the government was doing away.
Yeah, if you think of it as like a part of the greater phenomenon of the war on terror, and the way we were handling national security at the time. I mean, Obama specifically complained about Bush doing those kinds of things through the Patriot Act when he ran in 2008. He talked a lot about the problems he had with the war in Iraq and the greater war on terror. And he even cited his background as a student of constitutional law when he was in college, as why he knows about what the Constitution says and why this is a problem for him. And for him to suddenly not care about that was disturbing to me. And I would say my last year in college, and for perhaps about the first year after college, I had a very I really lost a lot of the trust I had in the Democratic Party. So I had this lull in activity where I really didn't know what to do, because I just wondered, is the Democratic Party going to do anything good for the American people anymore? Can they be trusted for anything? It was Bernie Sanders that really got me hopeful again. I saw him as basically the next FDR, someone who was going to help the Democratic Party recommit to the values it claims to have. And I think even though he didn't win the primary, he's been largely successful in pushing it back in that direction. I'm a big fan of FDR and the New Deal. I think that was the Democratic Party doing its best work for the country. That's our best track record. Our biggest accomplishments were from that period, from about 1932 to say 1968. If you push it up to things like Medicare and Medicaid.
So again, you majored in political science,
right?
So you caught a lot of that history,
right? Exactly, and I've looked for extra information in my own personal time as well, and that's the model Democratic Party that that I have in my mind. And I see a lot of our political figures give speeches sort of attesting to the idea of the party, but not actually living up to it. I think that was a problem we had with the Clintons, for example, and many of the people who worked closely with them over the past 30 years was they would say, we're the party of FDR, but I get the feeling that you put Bill or Hillary Clinton in, say, the Senate as Democrats in 1936 or something, they would have been voting against a lot of his New Deal policies. They would have been one of those. They would have been the kind of Democrats where in 1946, I believe, the North Carolina Democrats passed the right to work law in spite of Harry Truman. Harry Truman was trying to get a federal law passed to allow unionizing in every state. That law was defeated, and then the North Carolina Democrats, because the Democrats controlled the state for a century, passed the right to work law, basically killing unions in this state pretty much to this day.
Yeah, it's a little complex, but
it is.
But the history
Democrats are complex people.
The history of the Democratic Party in North Carolina and the South,
yes,
is tragically misunderstood by a lot of people still today.
Right.
When the Republican Party claims to be the party of Lincoln.
Well, that's the thing is they'll say, well, the Democrats were the ones who seceded and fought for slavery, but technically the people, technically they were members of the party.
The label was there. The label was the Democrats.
Those demographics are now Republicans. The descendants of those people who still share a lot of their values, if only more modernized. Obviously, they don't believe in slavery anymore, but they have 21st century parallel. Some of them do, but most of them don't. That's not the mainstream view. They have the same basic values that inform. Like, for example, I don't think it's a coincidence that the former slave states are also the states that are the worst in allowing people to unionize, right? I think slavery is an inherently anti-worker, anti-labor mentality. So it's not a surprise that it's hard for people to unionize in states like these, that the minimum wage in these states tends to be much worse than in northern states or bluer states or states that happily abolished slavery on their own well before the Civil War. There's a kernel of values that has followed from the signing of the Constitution and from the Civil War up to today that I think still informs a lot of these things. And so yeah, it might technically be true that the Democrats had a stronghold in the South, but those Democrats, made their peace with the Republican Party and had mostly joined it by 1980.
Yeah, and they became Republicans. The Republicans inherited the conservative Democrats.
Right.
For a long time, the Democratic Party was split between very conservative, George Wallace type, and very liberal.
Yes.
And the Republican Party also had a liberal wing.
Right. That's a very interesting thing about American politics. In, I guess, from the late 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century, was you basically had two centrist parties, but they had different brands of centrism. So the conservatives we saw with the Republicans were what you might call today, what's often called in scholarship a Hamiltonian conservative. So these were conservatives like Theodore Roosevelt, for example. Some people remember him as being more of a liberal president, but he really wasn't, and he stood away from the term liberal, although he did associate strongly with the progressive movement at the time, hence why he formed that progressive party with the bull moose logo and ran under such in 1912. Hamiltonian conservatives are a bit different than what we often call neoconservatives today, the sort of Reagan, Thatcher conservatives that developed in the West, in that Hamiltonians weren't afraid of the state. Even an example of a similar tradition is if you look to the German Empire in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they had a welfare system. And the idea of this welfare system had conservative motivations. Like, well, a healthy, able population, that's getting medical care or is being well fed, will be able to serve the nationalistic goals of the Kaiser better, right? So you can, the motivations were definitely more conservative. If you look at environmentalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that got us a lot of our first national parks, that got us the Department of the Interior. It was based on this sort of more conservative attitude about the environment, like we are protecting that which God gave us, to protect as stewards.
Putting the conservation back in conservative.
Right, and that's an interesting thing. Is like the idea of being an environmentalist as a conservative position is almost not here today because the American right has shifted toward the neoconservative movement since the 1980s, and there's not much of the Hamiltonian element left. I think I don't usually call myself a liberal because I do have conservative elements in my values, but they're more of the Hamiltonian variety. I'm not afraid of a government sufficiently empowered to serve public goods and promote the general welfare. I think that's, and one thing I think is interesting is in fact that probably the two biggest leaders of the progressive movement in what we call now the progressive era, which was 1898 to 1920, were conservatives. But so in two different parties, you had Theodore Roosevelt in the Republicans, but you had William Jennings Bryan in the Democrats. William Jennings Bryan never actually won his presidential elections, though he ran, I think, 4 times. He was taking on the big banks. He was sort of like an evangelical rural Bernie Sanders. And again, the idea that a person from that demographic would be a progressive today is a bit hard to imagine. But again, conservatism was a different thing. Men like Bryan were very informed by this idea of the Protestant work ethic, and they saw the 1% as basically enjoying the prosperity of the nation in a way that was at odds with the Protestant work ethic. They weren't working for this. They were rigging the system and exploiting people who worked hard and were sweating in the factories. And they said, hey, we need to change this. And even rich people like Theodore Roosevelt agreed with that. And so you had this interesting thing where in the election of 1912, the Republicans and the Democrats and then the Bull Moose Party were all vying for the mental progressivism, among Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson. And Wilson ended up winning the split in the Republican base that happened. But it was a thing where you couldn't, we have an idea of today of progressivism being just on the left, but at that time, and then even later on, in the New Deal era, we saw people vying for the mantle of progressivism. Like Eisenhower, as a Republican president, he did not dismantle the New Deal. He, in fact, in many ways, expanded upon it. And we saw that with the investments he did in our infrastructure. That's why we have our interstate system. We saw that with the investments he put in our public education system. And in some ways, he had more conservative motivations for it. It's like, we need to be competitive with the Soviets, similar to what the Kaiser wanted with his, his public investments in the German people. Whatever your motivations, though, these were very successful policies, and there was reason on both sides to pursue these kinds of things. I think one thing we've really done to shoot ourselves in the foot, with Democrats, particularly the Democrats who are more to the left, is that we're very hesitant to allow a kind of diversity of opinion nowadays. And this comes with the polarization, and Republicans do this, to themselves with their own side, where we don't allow the possibility that someone could support good policies from a conservative perspective. We want to write off conservatism as inherently evil way too often, and
it is.
that's one thing I don't like.
I'm going to take a wild guess that you did really well in political science in college.
I did okay. I mean, I seem like I know a lot, I guess, but some of it's I've learned since college. So college, I think one thing that's useful about college and the liberal arts thing is that it kind of sets you up to become a more active learner throughout the rest of your life. So what you're seeing is just some of those habits I learned, but I was an A student growing up, basically K through 12. That stopped when I went to college. And I got a bit tired of school by that point. A lot of kids got tired of school by the time they were in middle school or high school. And I sort of was just a little tired of classes and always going to school in college. So some of my classes I slacked a bit. I didn't necessarily get good grades. But I've always at least tried to... I definitely came out better for it. And I used what was given to me then. I've really tried to expand on it. And I haven't let a year go by where I haven't learned something new about the political history of our country or even of other countries. There's always something you don't know to read. There's always some case study or just series of events. Like if you read about the political history of just one country, that like Norway or something, you'll learn a lot of very useful stuff that can inform your voting decisions here in the United States.
Yeah, I did just the opposite. I was terrible student through high school and junior high school, and got out of high school in 5.5 years with an F+, and became an A student in college because my motivations totally changed. But part of it was because I was learning this stuff. I was doing something I really wanted to get into, and not paying very much attention to politics, which has kind of hurt me from the pundit side of things.
One thing that I think was really impactful about the way my time in college, how it influenced my my political education and I would say my own political maturation, was that I went from a conservative area to a liberal area, right? I mean, Person County, Timberlake, it's rural North Carolina, and the people there have the values. There's more churches than there are any other type of building. And you grow up around Southern Baptists. I mean, I wasn't raised that way. My parents were fairly, but they're basically secular. We didn't go to church. But most other people did. And these were my classmates. These are the people whose values I heard echoed the most. And, so I had this idea that, I'm a very liberal person because I disagree with my classmates.
And then you got to UNC.
I went to UNC. I met real liberals. And I said, okay, these people are a bit much for me. I mostly see myself as kind of a centrist. Not a centrist in the way I think the Clintons would decline themselves. Because, to be in the middle, you could be in the middle over so many things. Being a centrist is one of the least indicative terms. It's not a very useful label. But going back to what I said earlier about myself with Me Too is, I try to be agnostic for as long as possible on things. I try to remain curious about a topic before I take a firm stance and make sure I'm as informed as possible. And that sort of leads you to a kind of centrism. And so my interactions with a lot of my classmates at UNC and, how much more liberal they were, I began to realize, it's important to dial it back a bit. I don't take for granted the fact that being more left necessarily means that you have better ideas. I mean, if you go far enough left, you go back to the Soviet Union. And eventually they ran into problems, right? And so there's a cutoff point, and the important thing is to understand where that is, which is why I don't necessarily see politics the way I did then. And it got me to really reconsider how maybe I thought of or I treated conservatives in the past and what I thought about their motivations. One thing I will say that really irks me more, I guess, about the American left more than the American right is that the American left is really bad at assuming good intentions. I'm going
to remind you before you go any farther, you are going to be running in Chapel Hill.
Oh, I know, but I
ahead.
think again, I think what we need to do is we need to be frank about what we deal with. We can't have people who are just trying to please a crowd all the time and not make frank observations about problems on our own side. Because again,
that's what they think Trump does.
The voters, yes, and the voters who don't have loyalty to our party notice that we do this, that we speak in platitudes that don't mean anything, and that we don't police ourselves and keep ourselves honest, make sure our leaders are governing ethically and without things that would negatively influence their judgment, like when we look at campaign contributions, for example. And I think one thing that actually distracts from a lot of that, the fact that even Democrats in some cases can be bought out by donors, is the fact that they can use the culture war as kind of a wedge to sort of get people to immediately jump to a side and argue about something else. It's a very easy distraction for people because it's exploiting human psychology. We're much more likely to resort to identity-based types of disagreements because that's just how we behave. We're social creatures.
Trump's doing that every day, several times a day.
Trump is terrible about it. But I think one way it helps him is that.
But we do it too.
The identity group that he's playing to is the one that has the highest voting frequency. And so you get the people who are most likely to vote to really come together. You have that's very useful in electoral politics. And I think that's part of why he was able to eke out a win in 2016. That's a little harder for Democrats to do because we have such a demographically diverse voting base. We're trying to include all the races. We're trying to include men and women the same, people of different sexualities. It's really hard to find a common thing like that. And I think part of what we do in trying to be so inclusive is we have this nervousness where if people just don't seem as interested, at the very least, in certain cultural issues, it means they have these far-right fascistic motives. And I think that's to our detriment. I think we're alienating a lot of people in the middle. There's been more polarization, but the 5 to 10% of people that are in the middle are the people who will decide elections. And we want to make sure that, we're not. What's important for people in the middle is to feel that they're not going to be put up on the chopping block by one side or the other. As soon as they believe that, they're not going to vote for you, or they'll vote for the other side out of spite. And we're not making that case to people in the middle. And that doesn't mean we have to be. We don't have to be these nebulous, vacuous candidates when we run in elections to convince people in the middle. We just need to be clear that it's almost like people in the middle vote for a person's character more so than their policies. And this is why you saw a lot of people in the middle who had Trump as their first choice and Bernie as their second.
Charisma.
Or Bernie as their first and Trump as their second, because they basically saw the common character trait they had was that I'm not going to bow to the establishment. I'm not going to bow to the donors. And Trump and Bernie had different reasons for doing that. Trump because I'm so rich, I don't need the donors. Bernie because I'm just incorruptible. That would have been, I guess, what he would say, although I think he'd be more modest about it. Voters saw that. It resonated with them. And they said, well, they're not going to play these sorts of games with me. And some of them, ended up voting for Bernie, and then some of them ended up voting for Trump. And I think if you want to build as big of a coalition as possible, it is important to assume good intentions about people on the left, on the right, and in between. And we've sort of lost sight of that as Democrats. Some people, a lot of people, political scientists, but even just people who just been active in the Democratic Party a long time will note how, during the New Deal era of the Democratic Party, it was okay not to agree with the party on every single thing. If you were just on their side 80 to 90% of the time, you were considered a good Democrat. And you were allowed to have individual differences and allowed to make your own calls, and it wasn't the end of the world. But we're not really good at doing that anymore.
We're demanding ideological purity.
Exactly. And you just can't expect that of 300 million people in this country. That's just not going to happen.
What about that? I'm not sure what the percentage is out there that are, at least so far, are totally not tuned into anything political and won't until mid-October 2020.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. So I think those are a lot of our swing voters. Those are people who really need to be motivated to vote, really need to be given a reason to vote for your side. And
I think it's way more than 10%.
I think if millennials started voting more, it would be more.
You can get people in polls
right.
to commit to something, but I don't think that necessarily means that they're certainly not you and me in terms of awareness today.
Right. So this is what I think is the secret weapon that the Democrats really need to learn how to wield is that the more people that vote, the more we win elections. If every single American voted in every election, we would just sweep. Even red states would just flip overnight. And that's because younger people tend to vote for Democrats. And then the demographics that have lower rates of voting, usually like ethnic minorities, they tend to vote for Democrats. If these people just go to the polls, and it's not a negative statement that people don't go to the polls because, again, I think it's the job of a candidate to make the case that someone is motivated enough to go to the polls and vote for them. If they did go to the polls, though, it would be crushing victory for the Democrats every time. The Republicans, like I said, with Trump, is their voting base votes more consistently. So even though there are less of them, they ended up pulling above their weight a bit because they just have a higher rate of turnout. With Democrats, that's our thing, is we need to motivate our people to vote more. And so I think there's a lot of people who aren't tuned in, and these are often people who are working class, who doing two jobs, so they're doing 50, sometimes 60 hours a week. And so, they can't do, and they have kids to feed, right? And so when they're not at work, they're looking after their kids. I don't have any kids, and I'm working part-time at the moment. And so, I went to UNC, and not everyone gets to go to UNC. So I've had time to think about all this stuff and get into this sort of habit. But I understand and respect the fact that this is not the norm, and I can't expect that of everyone. What we have to do is find a way to really create more incentives for the people who aren't going to pay much attention until October, to pay more attention. If they only start paying attention maybe in September or August, that could be a big improvement, right? I mean, that's really how it is. And we need to make them feel like they're going to get something for their vote, right? You just look at it as like you're offering a contract that you want someone to sign, right? The only way you do that is if you make them feel like they're better off for having signed their name on that contract. And we need to look at winning votes with the same thing. Is what are these people going to get out of it? It's a big reason why I'm interested in running for NC House, even though it's a blue seat, is because I just want to make sure I'm doing what I can to push the party in that kind of direction, so that we're creating these incentives for North Carolinians who are struggling, and these are often working class people from various demographics and backgrounds, white, black, Latin, male, female. There's people from each of these groups that are having a really hard time in the post-2008 economy. It consumes a lot of their own time, their physical energy, their mental energy. And, you just can't expect everyone to think about what Senator so-and-so said when you have, hours of work to get in and bills to pay and then kids to get in bed by, 8 or 9. And it's really incumbent on candidates to have something so appealing that they can, get through that wall. And this is a big reason why millennials have lower voting rates. It's somewhat truer of younger generations, but a lot of these working class struggles that I just described are so common to millennials and to Generation Z as they're starting to enter adulthood now. That it's an added thing. In addition to just the way young people tend to be, they have come of age in this post-2008 world where the bandwidth is off for them. Now, there are some things that give them more information, like they have access to the internet, so there's stuff like that. But we've seen that can't always be the best thing. There's fake news and fake information that gets around. Yeah. And we've sort of started to see that that's not necessarily a right-wing phenomenon. It's just people can retweet something so quickly before all the information gets out that an idea or a narrative is accepted as true overnight, and that can be very impactful on the way we discuss issues moving forward. The speed of information is difficult as well, and these are all the barriers and hurdles we need to jump over in getting through to these voters. And I think the only way we can really do that is by being consistent in our posturing and our values. This is why I think Bernie Sanders was so successful despite his relatively outsider status and not having a lot of money behind him when he started in his 2016 campaign, is because it was really hard to find foul with him. And so, a lot of the campaigning that Bernie got, his supporters just did for him. I know they shared his videos. They, retweeted his stuff. They started like telling each other about where his rallies were. He didn't have to ask a whole lot of his supporters to get a strong campaign going. It should be interesting to see what he's doing now in the 2020 race with similar to the momentum from the previous one already behind him. But Bernie gave people an incentive.
That's one thing.
He gave them a solution to the problems of the post-2008 world. He basically said, "Hey, this thing that's eating up your time, that's dominating your concerns, here are things we can do to make it better. Here are things where maybe some nights you don't have to worry about putting your kids to bed because you can actually afford a sitter to cover for you. This is not things like that would seem like a normal part of American or first world existence, just aren't necessarily a fact nowadays. Yeah. And that's where we need to go."
I'm not doing my job real hard, which would be to stop you and interrupt you about every 30 seconds or so. I'm letting you go. Are you still a Bernie guy this year?
Yes, I am. I think he's correctly identified the problems that exist in post-2008 America with the impact of the recession, with the impact of the Citizens United case. I mean, I think it's bad for both the American economy, the state we're in, but also just the American Republic, this experiment in democracy that we started a little over 200 years ago.
I can see that. But it's not Bernie Hillary.
Right.
This time.
It's
Bernie 22 other people, some of whom are very close to his politics and are a lot younger.
Yes. Yeah, so some of my other preferred people are Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang. Those are probably my...
two of the people that may not make the debates.
Right, exactly. But those are probably my number 2 and number 3 choices after Bernie. If for whatever reason he ceased to be a part of the campaign. They have similar priorities as him. They're talking about the bread and butter issues, and they're not doing... They're getting away from the what I mentioned before, the habit of assuming bad intentions about the other side. So, like Bernie, I think they talk about issues in a way that brings up people's better angels. It doesn't get them to resort to their, more fearful and negative demons like we've seen with the politics of Trump.
Yeah. We are seeing still in the era of, the era of good feeling among the presidential candidates. Mm-hmm. That's not going to last.
No, it definitely won't. Yeah, there's
it's already crumbling when you get a couple levels below, and look at your Facebook comments, and their supporters are getting nasty about the other side. They're not yet, but the supporters.
It took a while for Hillary and Bernie, but it eventually did get to that point where it went from a mostly positive competition to a mostly negative one.
Yeah. And that'll happen. Mm-hmm. And I think I was listening to Rachel Maddow talk about that. One of the MSNBC people today, and they're saying, don't worry about that. I would kind of like to see the era of good feelings go for a good long time, but they said, don't worry about that. Trump isn't going to rely on any Democrat tarring of each other to come up with his material. He's already got it. So don't, if the Democrats argue with each other, do some negative campaigning, they're not handing ammunition to Trump.
Right.
Not any ammunition he doesn't already have.
He's going to say stuff no matter what. I guess my concern with the primaries becoming too negative is, the main reason why we didn't own the White House in 2016 is not enough of our people felt united and together as a party enough to turn out to vote. Some of it was flip over votes. Some people who voted for Obama twice voted for Trump in 2016. And we saw that in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. But even more often, these voters who voted for Obama twice just didn't vote in 2016, or they just left the presidential part of the ballot blank because they didn't like either candidate.
Did you swallow your Bernie pride and vote Hillary?
I actually didn't. I wrote in Bernie because the way I think she handled herself in the primaries really soured my perception of her. I went into the primaries actually thinking pretty well of Hillary Clinton, but my perception of how she would have been as a leader changed just based on things that developed with each day in the primary.
Can you tell how well a person will lead by how well they campaign?
I don't think it's so much that. I think it's the campaign revealed things about where she stood on issues, about what she was going to deliver on, and what her sense of priorities were. When I talk about one of the good things about someone like Bernie or Yang or Tulsi, in that they're understanding the issues of the post-2008 world. I didn't see really any notice of that from Hillary's own platform and what she was talking about. And again, I think this goes back to when her own campaign workers were saying amongst themselves, "We don't know what she stands for." That's a very big problem because the 2008 recession was the biggest economic crisis after the Depression. Second biggest in history.
That sounds like a little bit more oppo than what came directly from her staff.
I mean, yeah, there's some of that, but even if it wasn't from her staff, that was, I met people in the party who thought the same thing. And then I met a lot of people after the 2016 election, after we lost, who had been like Hillary all the way, who basically came out and said, yeah, that's sort of what I thought too. I just was voting for Hillary, but I wasn't voting for issues. And I don't really know what issues I was voting for. I've met several people who said that, and they're otherwise pretty decent party loyalists. That's an issue. There is, we lose a lot of our own base just by not committing to issues and not speaking to the things that people are actually feeling these days and suffering from.
The issues that get fervently debated in campaigns, that draw people in, that push people away, that swing people one way or the other. I'm going to make the statement that never comes up the day after the inauguration. They're gone. Those issues, forget it. New stuff comes up. Maybe some of those show up. Maybe a president will bring up something. And of course, a president doesn't decide what's going to go through Congress. Congress decides what bills are going to get introduced. The president can have a congressperson, senator, or House, or both in their camp and willing to bring some legislation to those houses on their behalf. But the president can't
you can't
initiate any of that. My point is that all of the campaigning, all the issues, all the issues that you hear about in campaigns are just going to be this deep anyway. You get no details. They're just talking points. They're just emotional push buttons that
I think
hopefully
for
get
some campaigns
somebody
that's
to vote.
definitely true. I do think they are still good litmus tests for what you can at least reasonably predict from what leaders will do when
I'm saying you
put in
can't
court.
reasonably predict anything.
I mean, that's true because you
And
don't
I'm
know.
a lot older than you are. I've
Right.
been through a few.
So one
things
thing
here.
about I think one thing that really shines a light on that is, say, the 2000 election is Bush's presidency was defined by 9/11. When people were choosing between Gore and Bush, or Nader in some cases, in 2000, nobody knew 9/11 was going to happen. That was a curveball that changed history and changed politics. Similar thing with the 2008 election. Obama was largely running on the issue of Iraq, but then the 2008 recession happened, and his he took office just after that, and his presidency is in large part defined by how he handled that crisis.
Yeah.
So there are things that come along that you can't foresee, and even some of the more local political figures and elected officials I've known, just in my involvement in the party over the years, have told me this, like, you'll never know what issue is going to come up and that you have to deal with.
Yeah. He did campaign on Obamacare some, but it wasn't the big thing, if I recall correctly. It wasn't
Right,
the big
it
thing.
wasn't. And he even said,
and then it turned
while
out to
he
be
was still
the big-
campaigning as the recession was taking off, he was like, I didn't run on the economy. I was here to, I ran because I wanted to do something about Iraq and what we're doing with our military policy in the world. And that was Obama's own words, paraphrased, but that is the reality of it. I guess what I want is a candidate who's actually, I have a feeling is going to be mindful of these changes and understand what the impact will be. I mean, there are some issues that we know are affecting us now that need to be dealt with. So one of the good things about Andrew Yang, for example, is he's talking about the impact automation is going to have on the American economy. That's almost like never mentioned among Democrats or Republicans. But we're starting to see, what's happening. I mean, we've seen lately how all of these self-checkout areas in stores have popped up in the last 4 to 5 years in stores, and they lay off cashiers when they do that, and that's pretty soon going to be the norm, where there's a panel or a kiosk that you visit and you don't have a cashier. And even more frightening is what's going to happen when automated cars put all of our truck drivers out of work, and that's the most common occupation in several states. And then there were just other industries that automation is going to erase a job without creating another one, in a 1-to-1 ratio. We might creating new jobs at about half the rate, and we already have the issue of an aging population where we have people who are going to be older and retiring. Yeah, and there's a smaller workforce to sustain them. And how do we deal with automation in a way that working class people aren't thrown under the bus, that we're meeting all of our needs as a society and people aren't left behind, and that the system itself doesn't break? Because if you just imagine automation to its most extreme, where no job needs to be done again, and you don't have an occupation by which you get an income, which you can then spend on things, the cycle of the economy sort of breaks down at that point, right? The idea where we work for our subsistence so we can get things that are produced. Producers are producing things, but because they don't have to hire anyone, where does an income come from that we can buy these things that are produced more cheaply, right? So these are the things we need to begin to talk about.
Star Trek and WALL-E.
Exactly. We need to talk about these things now, and we need to apply a little more foresight. That's why that's one of the advantages Andrew Yang has, I think, is that he's willing to do that. And
does he or you have a direction of I'm not asking for a solution, a direction of a solution?
So one thing he's pointed at is, for the next perhaps few decades is, he's talked about universal basic income, which is basically, if you look at it in just the terms of Keynesian economics, it's a subsidy to demand that is guaranteed to everyone in society. And it accounts for the fact that people will lose their incomes from jobs, so they won't be completely destitute. He's proposing $1,000 a month, so it would be a $12,000 annual income that you get in addition to whatever you get from working or from investments and stuff. But if you don't have those things, you're still getting $12,000 a year, and that's basically just something that so you can go out and buy things, and so that other people can stay employed. Because when you lose your job and you lose your purchasing power, then you're a customer that businesses lose at that point, and then they might have to start laying people off, and then it ripples. And we've seen this with every recession. And he's basically saying, well, if jobs are disappearing, that we might get in situations where that happens and we don't bounce back like we've typically done with typical business cycles, because the typical business cycle is about to change fundamentally. What I like about candidates like Yang and the other progressive candidates is that they're really going out of their way to anticipate these developments that are happening in the next, whether it's the next decade or the next 5 decades. They're presenting a vision of the future. It might not be the accurate one, but it's one where we'll at least have some kind of a contingency ready when these changes eventually emerge. I think the current direction of the party is if everything we do or say in a speech is a reaction to Trump's latest tweet, we're not going to have much to deliver. Like I'm 27. If I'm just thinking selfishly, right, I've got another 50 to 60 years left on this planet, assuming, nothing kills me earlier by some weird accident or anything. What are these weird accidents that we can prevent, right? If the glaciers melt and the entire global weather cycle is thrown off, and our agricultural centers are no longer good for growing crops because it doesn't rain there anymore, what do we do with that, right? What do we do when entire swaths of land just disappear? Those are more, I guess, scientific things, but then there are other things, like if we go back to the automation one, what do we do when millions of people are out of work and hungry and are determined to get food and keep their families alive at all costs?
But I keep hearing about the automation thing is that the productivity leaves the hands of the people and into robots, but the wealth still comes back to people. And how you get that when you don't have the job, I don't know, but
so UBI is an attempt to do that. And basically, what Yang has proposed is that you'd pass some sort of technology tax to help fund it. So the more you automate, you pay a tax. And so basically some of the gains you get from the automation go into this UBI fund that he wants to start.
And that becomes WALL-E, where we're just sitting in the recliners.
Right. And we really need to do a similar, like one thing where we failed to do that and we saw the impacts of it was with NAFTA. Right. So most of the job losses in the last 20 to 25 years that people have blamed on NAFTA have actually been due to automation, right? Like factory jobs get automated. About 20 to 25% of those jobs that have been lost, though, have been due to free trade, and NAFTA in particular. What we didn't do with NAFTA is we didn't basically place a tax on that free trade dynamic, like Yang wants to do with technology, that helped us redistribute the gains so that displaced workers, like in the Rust Belt states, would have something, would have some sort of alternative and wouldn't be totally thrown under the bus. And that's why we saw an enormous acceleration of income inequality during that period, because we didn't do that. And many places, for many reasons, the recession occurred as a direct result of something like NAFTA. It was meant to enrich America as a whole, but it didn't do that. And whenever you change the economy, there's going to be some winners and losers to varying percentages. We did not successfully maximize our number of winners and minimize our number of losers in the way we handled something like NAFTA. We saw the consequences of that. So we've seen that automation takes away more jobs than NAFTA, and there's still a lot more of it to be done. So what we have to look at is, what can we learn from something like the way NAFTA wasn't properly handled? And I'm not saying we get rid of NAFTA, because that's out of Pandora's box, and we can't unwind that. We're seeing the effects that the UK is suffering from trying to get out of the EU, and the certainty of open trade. It's too hard to unwind at this point. But we can look at something like automation and say, well, what can we do to make sure that the gains from it go back to the people, and that our civil society remains intact as a result? Because when you displace millions of workers in what, from an economist's point of view, is just a fortnight, people will get hungry and desperate and potentially violent. And I'm really worried, especially when you do that in a context where politics is as polarized as it's ever been in this country. I'm worried about the fallout of something like that. And so when I look at campaigns, when I look at primaries, I want to make sure that even though they can't predict everything, that candidates are at least giving these concerns and the presence of these developments their due observation and their due consideration.
I'm going to have to change your title from, your title's way over there. I can't get it. Here, I can do it like this. There you go. Candidate for NC House. You're heading for Iowa. You're candidate for president. We do need to dial it back to North Carolina politics.
Yes. On
a couple of levels. Well, first of all, you are going to run for House District 56, which is about looks like 6 square blocks of Chapel Hill now. It's kind of been narrowed down. I'm exaggerating, but Chapel Hill, Carborough. That race hasn't geared up yet, right?
It hasn't, no.
Have you officially done any paperwork yet?
No, the filing period isn't until much later in the year, so there's no paperwork to do for the time being. It's sort of that period for elections where people just say they want to run, and that's what you take as an official candidacy. So I've made my statement.
You know how this works because you've done it before.
Right. So I made my statement. You pulled up the Medium post. I've gone out in public and made some appearances. Hasn't been a whole lot just yet because, again, the primary is almost a year away. But I do think it's interesting that you talked about how, a lot of what I say is pertinent to maybe American politics generally. One thing I think is interesting about North Carolina is as a state, it's a good microcosm of the entire country. So we're good because we're a swing state for a reason, because there are things that interest Democrats a lot, and there are things that interest Republicans a lot, with the kind of demographics we have, with the kind of geography we have, and with the kind of history that we have. And so where some states are mostly explained by the struggles of rural America, and some states are more defined by the struggles of urban America, it's about evenly both for North Carolina, because it's a southern state, so there's that rural part, but it's been one of the more urbanizing ones over the last half century. And we've seen that in the Triangle area, the Triad, the Charlotte metropolitan area. When we look at, if I just look at where I grew up,
it's urbanizing, but it's also highly divided between rural and urban.
Yes, so there's a very stark difference in cultures, and I see that a bit, like having gone from Person County, growing up there, to living in Chapel Hill now, first as a student, and now it's just as a full-time resident. You can see that difference right there. And so what the difference is that, say, pit Nebraska against New Jersey happen within this state, more or less, right? Those dynamics are at work within regions of this state. and they sort of explain the sum that is North Carolina politics. And so I think if we can if we can figure out how to bridge gaps within North Carolina with these divides that we have, we can start doing that with the greater United States, I think. So if you look at, for example, we often talk about something like NAFTA, how it impacted northern states like Michigan, Wisconsin. It's had impacts on North Carolina, though, with the textile factory jobs we have. Person County used to at least be better off when it had a lot of those factory jobs, but those jobs have disappeared, and the couple that remain are on their way out. It's becoming an aging area where young people can pretty much expect to, when they start their lives, to live in poverty on minimum wages or slightly above that don't come close to meeting the needs of caring for yourself, much less a family. And I can even see that a bit when I go to Orange County and you look at the gentrification that's going on. Like the apartment I just lived in has basically they took it down because they want to extend a road there in Chapel Hill. They're going to rebuild this apartment as luxury apartments. Before that, it was something in a more affordable range. Like I had a 2-bedroom, 2-person apartment. We were paying about $1,000 a month in rent. That's about the cheapest we could get for that level of living quality when we were my roommate at the time and I were looking around. And
$1,000 split between the two of you.
Yeah,
$500 each.
Yes, about $500 each. And that even that was pretty tough. And now what we're seeing is that one.
And you're calling that a modest rent,
right? As for Chapel Hill standards, but now that's going to become luxury apartments. And this is just true of the entire Chapel Hill area. Is that there's gentrification going on. You see it in Durham as well. And to a large part, it's already happened in Wake County, much more. We're seeing it sort of radiating out from Raleigh to the rest of the state. And, people who don't have good incomes, people who have been displaced by the post-2008 economy here in North Carolina are struggling to deal with that. Because what's happening is we're crowding our poorest and weakest within these, frailer communities. In many ways, this is happening in places where Democrats have the reins. So, at the municipal level or at the county level, particularly in Wake, Durham, and Orange, Democrats control the government, and a lot of this gentrification happens more or less with the blessing of these Democratic local governments. That's a very big problem when we also claim to be the party that wants to fight for education in the state. Because when you put all the poor people in the same place, that affects the quality of the schools. Like I can see night and day the difference between my school system in Person County and the school system in the Chapel Hill Yarborough schools, the city schools. And you can even see a night and day difference between the county school system and the Chapel Hill Yarborough city school system.
Is solving the gentrification issue a state level issue or
I think
local?
In some ways it is. So,
and what would you have the state do? So
one thing that the state can do to help working class people more so that the effects of gentrification are mitigated is we look, for example, at the fact that local governments are not allowed to raise their minimum wages. So where we might have these democratic local governments willing to join the fight for 15 and set a minimum wage there so that the people who work there can afford to live there, state law prevents them from doing that. That's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is, and this is a mistake we have to fix as Democrats, is repeal right-to-work laws in the state and allow unions to be a reality in a way that they aren't. The only unions that really manage to get at least a minimal footing here are ones that operate nationwide, and they're able to sort of set up operations here, and they rely on the fact that they have members from other states building into their organizational infrastructure. But for the most part, though, that's not the reality. That's the exception. And when workers don't have the ability to bargain as well with their employers, we see just over the last century of political and economic data what that means. And we can see how the standard of living for the average American in the 50s and 60s, when unions were much more common and normal and had the impact that they did on pay, that despite some of the social issues and cultural issues where we were behind, the average American could come out better than they were about a half a century ago, just economically speaking, than is the case today.
Yeah, but that's not North Carolina's right to work law that's in the way. That's unions losing power, even in states where unions can require membership.
Right, and we saw that recently in Kentucky. They've just repealed the right to work law there, and that's going to be a disaster for them. But I do think that while it is unfortunate that unions, I guess, lost their ability to wield clout, they never really had it here in North Carolina in the first place. In states where they've always just been too common to lose their clout, like in some of the more northerly states, they haven't had that problem. But we pretty much nipped it in the bud here pretty early as a state, and it's never been able to flower. So we really have to go out of our way to provide that momentum for unions so they can get going, and then ultimately, lobby for themselves. But again, that requires us to be proactive, and that requires us to be a Democratic Party that's going to live consistently with the values that it usually preaches to have.
So what I'm hearing, at least in terms of gentrification, is not so much put a lid on rents to rent control, things like that, but rather bring up the bottom so people can afford the gentrified rents.
Yeah, so, one good quote I saw from Commissioner Mark Markopoulos from Orange County, he said, because there was this was right before I deleted Facebook, and there was a conversation about affordable housing some people were having.
So maybe you should go back to Facebook.
And he made this one. It was a rare gem in a in a maelstrom of toxicity that Facebook has become, where he said, at the end of the day, the real reason that we need affordable housing is because people can't afford it, right? If you build up the households and the individuals that make up a society, that I think is just going to be a much more far effective solution to something like gentrification, rather than, affordable housing is almost, it sort of relies on the assumption that we're just going to put all the poor people in one area. And that can't be the solution. What we need to do is just deal with the issue of poverty generally and make it so that there's not a part of town where all the poor people live, because we've done what we can to eliminate it. If we look at, for example, what Utah did, and this is really interesting for Utah because they are a deep red state. They're the only state in the country that has adopted a policy where they will house their homeless. So if you are homeless in Utah, you can get housing provided by the state of Utah. The reason they did that is because they found that when you do this, it is actually, in terms of like what the state budget feels, it's actually money saved, because people who are homeless are less likely to go to ER and have to deal with whatever they've exposed themselves to in terms of injury or disease that has gone neglected and gotten to a very negative point, because they're safe in a home where they can maybe not get attacked by any dangers that are outside in the night. They're not exposed to the elements. When they have a home, they can hold down a job more, so they're producing more income, putting more value into the economy. This helps the state budget with its taxation. They're also, less likely, when you're poor and you're homeless, you're more likely to resort to petty crimes, and these have, they damage public property, they damage people who themselves are, other citizens who themselves are part of this system of trying to put value into the economy and therefore putting more in the state budget. Everyone's better off when you house the homeless, right? That's the kind of thing where we can deal. Like, let's build up the individual so that they can not only be better off themselves, but it will spill over for the rest of us. We need to look at North Carolina, I think, with similar strategies when we talk about living wage.
I want to ask how they do that in Utah. I actually spend a fair amount of time in Utah every year, a couple of weeks. And I'm always there the week that is their State of the State address from their governor. Mm-hmm. They don't talk about that. It's not something I've heard anybody discussing. But do they... You were saying don't put all the poor people in one place because that's where the poor people are going to live. Mm-hmm. How do they actually do it? Do they just subsidize rents so you can pick wherever you want to live? Do they build public housing?
I haven't looked into the details of that. I would say, though, that generally speaking, the big problem with affordable housing, and I don't know if Utah has done it this way because I haven't. It's been a couple years since I looked at what they do, so my memory is a bit vague. But I think the important thing to do is you don't want to create sort of nodes of weakness within a system. So when you do housing, affordable housing, and you end up having a lot of poor people in one area, you end up having an area that is much frailer and more likely to experience problems in volume that can then reach a critical mass and lead to lead to problems that get out of hand. You sort of want to spread out. If we're going to do affordable housing, a good way to do it, so the kind where we might provide it to homeless people, is have it spread out so that people can get housing in more conventional neighborhoods, and that the state is willing to subsidize that. You don't just get housing for people in a cheap area, like a cheap building project, but you just find the normal apartments, and you say, we're going to subsidize this at this cost, and integrate people into normal society. I mean, this is the thing. This is why in the military, they generally don't like to make completely new freshman units and then send them to the front line. What they do is they take new recruits and they integrate them into experienced units, so you don't have one unit that just completely fails to deliver on a mission objective, because one unit failing can just compromise the entire operation. It's similar how we do our economic and infrastructural and political systems. We don't want to have one thing that is such a dead weight. It actually brings the whole thing down. The way we do affordable housing, where we just want to put all the poor people in one area, more or less gets us in that situation.
So there are probably another half dozen to a dozen issues that we could talk about in that depth, and we don't have time. Even for a podcast, although there's no specific time limit, we're closing 2 hours here.
Oh, wow. Time flew.
It's fun, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the good thing about this discussion format is there's so much to say on every issue. And, I think it's useful for Democrats who really want to make a difference to know, here's where we're falling short, where we have a little bit more say. And here's the priorities we need to emphasize when we're overlooking. And here's why it's important that we not overlook it. So, I'm happy to run at the very least, because my campaign is more or less a platform to bring these issues more to light. I myself don't really have problems with Verla Insko as a representative. And in the 20 plus years she's been a representative, she's done good things for the state. But things are taking a new direction, both in North Carolina and in America. And the only way we'll be able to respond to them effectively and proactively is if we have candidates who talk about them. And I'm following the example Bernie Sanders set. Talk about them, run on them, challenge some folks so that people have to think about them, so they can't ignore them. And then we can finally start reaching actual policy solutions to these problems. So whether I win or lose, if I can move the discussion more toward the issues that I want to see solved, I consider that a win.
Verla Insko is the incumbent and a Democrat, and your race will be the primary.
Yes, that's
whoever wins the primary.
That's the one to win.
Yeah, whoever wins the primary. This is one of those probably somewhat gerrymandered districts, although we're getting less gerrymandering in the state level House and Senate races.
Well, Chapel Hill Carborough area is like an 80-20 Democratic voting pattern anyway.
Yeah.
So if you just draw a circle around Chapel Hill Carborough, that's just what you're going to get. It's trying to make it more balanced. We get you one of those districts that probably actually looks like the gerrymander creature of other districts. Interestingly, with Chapel Hill Carborough.
Yeah, which is another whole discussion. In any case, you're going to be fighting a Democrat, an incumbent of a long term, the longest serving Democrat.
Yeah, she is the most senior Democrat in the North Carolina House right now.
Yeah. Do you think are you coming at her from the left, the right? Are you coming at her from the middle?
I guess maybe the middle. I think of myself as a centrist. There are some things about me that might seem more left than other Democrats. There are some things about me that might seem more right than other Democrats. It's mostly the issue. Probably the ones I'm most likely to talk about seem like from the left. So, talking about minimum wage, talking about unions, talking about automation and universal basic income. A lot of these are socioeconomic things that are usually seen as more left, and those are the things I'm going to be emphasizing, as well as things like public education in the state. I think we've done too much college is too expensive for what the return on investment is. And so another big problem with the post-2008 economy is, in addition to these jobs that don't pay well, we've millennials and Generation Z is getting into this as well, as they've absorbed a tremendous amount of personal debt with college, because we were raised on this idea that you go to college, you'll make more money, because the general trend was that people with degrees made more money. But putting out more degrees didn't create more high-paying jobs, and we've learned that lesson the hard way. It is amazing how many of these low-paying service industry jobs that I've worked have been filled with people who have masters and PhDs.
You got a political science degree.
Right. Well, but like there are people with master's degrees and PhDs who are working for $9, $10 an hour.
Yeah, I mean, you go downtown to the political science store and get a job as a clerk. I'm not saying people shouldn't get philosophy degrees and political science degrees and stuff. Yeah, I went in a communications curriculum. It taught me how to run all this stuff and how to do programs like that. Didn't teach me how to argue politics very well, as you can tell from this one-sided dialogue.
I say right. I don't mean that you don't argue politics well, but your point is taken.
Yeah. But your career path is a politician, I guess.
Yes.
Or a teacher.
Or I don't want to teach.
You probably could. You could lecture well.
I know a lot of things. I don't know if I'm necessarily good at making people understand other things. And that's a talent some people have that I don't think I do, if I'm just being honestly self-critical. But I do think you've touched on something that, a degree isn't necessarily something that will make you more money.
Well, I think the statistics show that it does.
It's something that can enable you to make more money, but just simply going and getting a 4-year degree and study what you want and let your heart be your guide. And this approach that we've given to education isn't working out for us. I think one thing where there is some truth in what the Republicans say about college-level education is that we're not emphasizing the vocational, professional aspect of it enough to where the return on investment is worth what we put into the degree. And so we've seen a thing where college has become more expensive, but what you get out of it in your career is even less. And then that's just a fact. And that just can't hold anymore. And so when we look at North Carolina as a specific example, because we have our famous university system that is the envy of several other states, what we do with that is going to be even more impactful than what can be done in other states. And if we handle it right, if we retool our higher education strategy as a state to enable people to operate and subsist and get an income in the post-2008 economy, we can then be a model of success for other states as they look to solve other things. And that's one of the great things about state-level politics is you're sort of a laboratory for democracy and public policy.
Okay, so a great thing about state-level politics. A bad thing about state-level politics is that almost nobody knows who their senator and representative is. I mean, I'm not talking about understanding the nuances of the positions in a race. I'm talking about they've been elected and you don't know who they are. You may have voted for them and you don't remember who you voted for. You voted a party. And
that becomes even more problematic when we're constantly changing the districts. So who your representative is can be very different depending on what day of the year you're talking.
Yeah, bopped around in a couple different districts here. And I've lived in North Carolina for 30 years. Of those 30 years, 2 years, the past 2, I could tell you who my representatives are. 28 years that I couldn't tell you. And I'm not a dummy.
Right. No, clearly not. I've met some dummies in my life. I'm not going to talk about them, but
I think I know who the mayor of Cary is. I think I have a city councilman or an alderman. I don't even know what they call it. And I don't know who that is.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of people to keep track of, all of the elected officials. In nationwide, there's over 500,000 elected officials. That's a lot of people.
Yeah. I know who our 2 North Carolina senators are, and I think I'm an exception in knowing that.
Yeah, I would say that's the thing is, as you mentioned before, maybe an hour ago, a lot of this stuff isn't on people's radar until about October. And that's even more as you go down the ticket to the state and even the local level.
And at that point, they're only paying attention to the hot buttons.
Right, like House Bill 2 or
they're
something
listening,
like that.
Yeah, they're
or
listening
the abortion
to the
bill recently.
They're listening to the commercials. They're looking at the mud that's being slung and not really understanding what real issues are. And like I say, that part of the campaign, whatever you think you're voting for, that's not what's going to come up once somebody gets voted in.
Right.
So I mean, that's my cynical take on politics.
I mean, yeah, that's largely true. And you know, I if I've learned anything, it's that you really can't expect what you really can't have any expectations about the future, because things that seem to make perfect sense, like this is the way things will go, that's just not how life works. And if that's true of, you know, my individual life, it has to be true of our political systems, because those are made of individuals. Like, for example, this is, I think, is a big thing, is when we look at the impact of Ted Kennedy's untimely death on the Affordable Care Act. You know, that might well have been the difference between, because in the election they had to fill the seat, a Republican won that. And that might well have been the difference between an ACA that had a public option and one that didn't. And that's pretty impactful in terms of, you know, what the success of the ACA could have been compared to what we have now. It was a much more milquetoast package. And in some ways, millions of Americans suffered from it.
As happy as I am to have it,
yeah,
it was terrible.
Yes. Well, I think it does illuminate the problems with the private healthcare system, and how it doesn't work. It doesn't offer the same value, the same advantages that private sector ventures often do in a free market system, because it's just pooling money
for the people who can afford them.
But and just in terms of the product, you're pooling money. There's really no way to make pooling money better. We figured out how to pool money and issue payments in the Middle Ages, more or less.
Yeah, but we leave people out.
Right, exactly. And so what you have to do then is just blow it up to scale, and then have the efficiencies that come with scale. And the only way to do that is with a universal healthcare system.
Yeah, single payer,
right?
Universal. Two words for kind of the same thing.
Right, yes. And there's different ways you can do it, and European countries do it in different ways to varying degrees, and all of them have the advantages that come with scale and its efficiencies. And it's just, we're just fooling ourselves as a nation to think that we can put that off. And unfortunately, that is one thing that is a bit harder to do at the state level, because we can't even expand Medicaid here. And I sometimes wonder if we even would if Democrats won back the state government, to be honest. Again, that's another reason why I think candidacies like mine are important, is because we really need to motivate Democrats to deliver on these issues.
So how will you campaign when campaigning begins? I mean, you don't get TV.
Right.
And you don't do TV commercials.
Right. I don't think the return on investment would necessarily be good for something like that. What I intend to do is...
Plus, you got no money.
Right, yeah. So what I intend to do is as many public appearances as I can, and then just do a lot of door knocking. That is the most effective form of campaigning. That's why when campaigns can pay people to go knock on doors, they pay them to do that. And the research has verified again and again that you win more votes from canvassing and knocking on doors than you do from anything else. And phone banking is the next best thing you can do after that.
Is that because people like getting a little attention paid to them? Because they're not going to then spend 2 hours on your website understanding your positions in detail.
Right. I think when you look at the voters who are very character oriented and need to feel like there's an incentive for them to vote for you, if you're able to go to them and engage directly with them and show that you're paying attention to them, that their neighborhood and their demographic is being taken seriously as part of the voting constituency, that the candidate has an interest in bringing you on board, that tends to resonate with people a lot more. And it's just, again, we're looking at humans as social creatures. You have a social experience with a voter. That's better to get their vote than some sort of indirect message you could put on TV or on a website. As useful as those resources can be, if you can look someone in the eye and say, this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to do for you, that's going to be a lot more convincing than reading that verbatim on a computer screen. Especially if you really mean it and you give every indication through social cues and stuff that you mean it. I've consistently found that, like, I've talked to Trump supporters before, and I've had conversations where we come out and they say, if I see you on my ballot, I'll vote for you because I think you're honest, I think you're trustworthy, and maybe I don't completely understand why you support things you do.
and you're too half.
I think you have my best interest at heart.
Too smart by half.
So. Right, and I don't let the fact that someone says they voted for Trump turn me away from them or not take their concerns and suffering seriously. Because the bottom line is, a lot of people voted for Trump because their lives suck. And again, it's just, what incentives are you going to give? I mean, a lot of what Trump said is, we're going to give you your jobs back.
Yeah.
People
He
really
lied,
want that.
but he said that.
He lied, but that's what people want. And we just need to give them a candidate that's not going to lie about it, that's actually going to give it to them. And we start by running on that, like Trump did, however dishonestly he did it.
Yeah. Local TV stations also won't get down to your level. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not going to get in a debate on WTVD among a variety of candidates at for state house levels. Maybe WUNC would invite you on once. I don't know.
Possibly.
Maybe
it's something that could happen. But even if I did, I don't know how many people would necessarily tune in.
Yeah. Indie Week has got a podcast now.
Right.
But it's just once a week. From now until the election, they couldn't get everybody in.
Yeah. And
so you managed to score the Triangle Talk Show, but nobody watches this.
Well, not yet. Maybe things will pick up. Maybe I'll bring a whole new audience to your show. I don't know. I'm kidding.
That's what I'm counting on from everybody I bring in. It hasn't happened yet. But, I mean, you'll have a link, and you can say, if you want to listen to me talk in depth about stuff for 2 hours, here, go watch or listen to this.
This is a far more useful, because here's a good thing about podcasts is people can actually fit this in because it's mostly audio. I mean, there's a video for those who want it, but if you have to make a commute to work, you can listen to the first half of a podcast, and then you can listen to the second half on the way back. Yeah. And that's how an increasing number of young people are getting in touch with the issues is through that. That's why the Joe Rogan podcast is so popular, because it's very easy. And then the depth of it, the length and the ability to sort of explore each detail and why we think the way we do, allows people to understand what argument a person is making, whether they're a candidate or not, and what their motivations are.
Yeah. What media do you consume?
I don't really watch TV much, right? So I mean, I'm like most millennials in that I go online. I find some podcasts that I find interesting. I listen to them as I'm able to fit in my time. There aren't very many news sources I trust. I don't really trust most of the corporate media like CNN or MSNBC, even though they tend to favor Democrats more. Is just because I can see that they have an agenda. They're not going to promote things that they think will hurt their profit margins. They're not going to put out full story and good information. And I've seen them run away with bad information sometimes and not really be willing to correct. So
Fox News is it for you?
Yeah, Fox News started the tradition, and the other mainstream outlets eventually caught up. They're still not as bad as Fox News, but they're too similar for me to be able to trust them.
Yeah, I watch Rachel Maddow pretty religiously. The rest of MSNBC, not so much.
I don't care for them so much. So podcasts I really like, of course, is the Joe Rogan show, because he'll talk directly to people and let feel out how they feel about things. I like the Sam Harris podcast, and I mentioned him before. And then I sort of sample other podcasts sporadically, but I'm very much of like the sort of YouTube generation where I try to find competent people who are not putting like spin on things, and see what they have to say about things.
So you're not a crooked media fan,
right? Oh no, and the American media has had a big hand in the polarization that's happened in this country, because they're running on sensationalism. They're trying to make money from these exciting stories, and exciting stories have made Americans afraid of each other because it's got their adrenaline levels up and more distrustful of each other.
Yeah. How about the 538 podcast? Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Haven't really listened to it much.
They quite directly admit they are not policy. They are a horse race. Mm-hmm. That's all they look at. They'll look at policy as it affects the horse race.
Right.
But it's still interesting to listen to. And although I get the impression that most of them are on the left, like most people in media are, there's balance in that they care about the horse race across the board. So they'll talk about what seems to be working for one, for one candidate, not working for another, things like that. So I enjoy listening to them. Preet Bharara, my favorite podcast today. Mm-hmm. Super smart guy. He's the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York that Trump said, you got a job, and then turned around and said, no, you're fired. So he's left leaning some, but super smart, and doesn't beat you over the head with it.
Yeah. I think I saw an interesting article not too long ago, and it was interesting because I thought about it, and then a week later I saw it. I can't remember where this article was. It might have been on Quillette. Quillette's maybe one of the, even though that's more of an opinion site, that's maybe one of the more written things that I'm actually willing to read. Because it's balanced. It's not an agenda. It's people speaking honestly about what they think.
How is that spelled?
Quillette is Quillette, I believe. And they had an article. I believe Quillette had this article, basically saying, yeah, that should be it. That Joe Rogan is the Walter Cronkite of this generation. Because
I've heard snippets of Joe Rogan, and I wasn't immediately drawn in. I'm going to have to listen a little bit more because he gets talked about all the time.
Well, he's often described as the biggest media figure that nobody knows about. And when we say nobody, we're talking about the mainstream figures. Like CNN doesn't seem to know about him. MSNBC, Fox News, they don't seem to be aware of how big of an audience he has. But each of his podcasts regularly gets like 5 to 10 million listens, if not more. And it's more high-profile ones.
5 to 10 million listens for CNN is 5% of their audience.
Yeah.
So they're like Biden being out there not wanting to engage anybody else yet because he's got such a big lead. Nothing in it for him to talk about any competition yet. So for CNN to look at Joe Rogan and 10 million people, I would love 10,000. I would love 1,000, but that's chicken feed for the cable networks.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is that these 5 to 10 million views aren't all the same people, because I don't watch every episode of Joe Rogan. So more realistically, he probably has an audience that's close to maybe 50 to 80 million. And he's one of the main sources I think a lot of millennials use to learn about issues and people. And he got the CEO of Twitter recently on his show and talked. He's had Elon Musk on his show. Tulsi's been on his show. Andrew Yang recently appeared on his show. And he's had some more controversial figures on his show, like he's had Alex Jones on there, for example. What's great about his podcast...
Alex Jones isn't controversial, he's just a butt.
Well, maybe same side of different sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But what's great about his show is he'll pry at folks and converse with. He won't try to trap them necessarily, right? He might disagree with them and say, well, yeah, what about? But he's not looking for a gotcha moment. And that's very important in our discourse, politically, culturally, is that you get the best understanding of a person and their issues if the media figure is not looking for a gotcha moment. And people didn't see that about Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite just sort of went to learn things and report the news just as plainly as he saw it. Nobody suspected any ulterior motives on his part. Yeah. That's why he was the most trusted man in America. And that's the thing that people often like about Joe Rogan.
I will say that is why I like Rachel Maddow. Because she doesn't do 6 talking heads in boxes, all shouting at once. It's a calm, deliberate dialogue. She doesn't get a lot of people on that are like from the other side because they won't go on the show. But she gets some. And when she does, it's a respectful dialogue that gets into real things and no gotcha questions. But she is a little bit different from, and probably can command that from MSNBC when they would rather have her talk to 6 people at once in little boxes. She can command that because she's got the audience. Everybody else around her does the same cable news thing.
I think perhaps, in my view, the show in the mainstream media that comes the closest to giving a balanced approach would probably be Real Time with Bill Maher. Before I got into a lot of listening to these podcasts that I do, I was a big fan of Real Time, just because Bill Maher would bring Republicans and libertarians on his show and let them get their point across. And he would, he's a comedian, so he's got his snarky jabs he gets in, but, he'll be friends with these people he disagrees with. Like, he's friends with Ann Coulter. And I don't think there's a single thing where I agree with Ann Coulter. And he probably doesn't either. But Ann Coulter can reasonably trust Bill Maher enough that she can come on his show and say what she thinks, and he won't try to make life miserable for her. That is, in my view, as mainstream media goes, that's probably the closest thing that gets to what I want. And the unfortunate thing about real time is it's never quite long enough. Some of the discussions, because it's still confined to that TV formatting and packaging that you don't have so much with streaming services these days.
Yeah, I don't watch it very much. He doesn't put people in windows, but he's still got 5-6 people on the show.
Yeah, exactly. And so it can be pretty crowded, especially when he brings on his special guest, who is like, after he's already got the panel of 3, he brings on a 4th, sometimes a 5th. And that can be a bit much because they're all bouncing off of each other. But for the most part, that's far better than other people because it's a more laid-back format, and he'll basically let them make their point. And he gives everyone time to share their view. And I've learned some things from Republicans and Democrats watching that show that I hadn't learned before. So that's the value of his show. But the great thing about long-form discussion, where you can go on for 2 or 3 hours, like a lot of these podcasts do, is you get what you had on real time to the power of 10, basically.
Oh, you're bucking for the 3rd hour here. Now I actually gotta go pick up my wife from the train. So
okay.
On the train back from Charlotte.
Well, wives are not lightly less stranded.
No, that would be a problem. I really appreciate you coming on here to talk like this. This is the most fun time I have during my week.
Oh, great. This has been great for me. I'm glad you're doing this. I really hope it picks up. I think where we can have something like this that's more oriented toward North Carolina is very valuable. I'm definitely going to be a regular listener coming out of this.
All right. Thank you. That's one.
All right.
I've got 2 or 3 others. Let's see. I got your title here somewhere. Joe Parrish, candidate for North Carolina House in the 56th Congressional District, House District. Mm-hmm. There's no Congress about it.
Right.
North Carolina House District 56 over in Orange County, which this is the Triangle talk show, but I don't talk about them often enough.
We're sort of the weaker vertex of the triangle.
The People's Republic of Chapel Hill.
Yes.
I just keep having to note that, Triangle is defined by Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. Mm-hmm. You are in Cary, which is 3 times bigger than Chapel Hill right now. Mm-hmm. So just so you know where you are. We'll stamp your visa on the way out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I like the freedom of travel I get with my connections.
I am Gary Pierce, not that Gary Pierce. I'm the other Gary Pierce. Oh, it still says Choice Pro. I keep forgetting to change my title on here. The last episode was a pro-choice thing. So I became the Choice Pro.
I see.
Even though I'm a choice amateur. We're going to go away. I signed this program off the same way every time. And I'll give you a chance to join in. Your military, I don't know if you ever play with radio stuff. You can see the stuff behind me, the ham radio stuff. Mm-hmm. Did you ever play with communications? Any commo stuff when you were in the military?
Yeah, we had some light introductions to radio stuff. I never ran into moments where I had to use them so much, but I think I have an idea of where this is going.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a 3-word thing. I'll give 2 words, and we'll see if you can find the last word.
Okay.
I have to get over here and get ready to close out the YouTube. Push the right button. Okay. Here it is. Over and
out.
Piece o' cake.